For most of my adult life, I've had a sense that somewhere in the midst of our ancient memory, we were left a clue to help us understand who we are as individuals, who we are as a species. From ancient temples and tombs, buried underneath centuries of sand and debris, to fragmented texts and monasteries in the mountains of Egypt and the high deserts of Peru, the American desert Southwest. For nearly 2 decades, my search has continued, and it's in these places that the ancients found themselves on a very similar search. Well, it's in these places as well that our ancestors left clues to a lost knowledge for those who would follow in their footsteps. If we have the wisdom to recognize their gifts, and we can find within ourselves the courage to honor the legacy of their search, we may find that the answers to our greatest mysteries are closer than we think. Through their understanding, we are given new meaning to each moment and every day of our lives. This is a journey of exploration, discovery, mystery, and insight. It leads us to the powerful wisdom of the ancients and to the knowledge of what they call the most powerful force, the single most powerful force in the universe. It's a force that lives within every one of us. Almost universally, ancient texts and traditions and our most cherished history, they tell us in the language of another time that the events of the world around us and the healing and the joy or the sadness within our bodies are directly related. That they're related in ways that in the West we've only begun to understand. Western science, under laboratory conditions, began to establish the fact that we are surrounded by a field of what is called unconventional energy. It permeates all of creation. This field that has only been recently discovered is characterized as being everywhere, all of the time. It's a field that apparently has been with us from the moment that creation began, from the time scientists call the Big Bang. What makes this field so very, very interesting is that scientists today describe this field as having an intelligence. They say that we are permeated with an intelligent field that responds to coherent human emotion. In the traditions of the ancients, almost universally, there is a wisdom that says to us, there's something that we can do every day in our lives. Something we do in our lives triggers a process in our bodies. And that process interacts with the forces of creation around us and affects our physical world. And when that happens, creates what we call miracles. They're only miracles until we recognize that we are related to all that we see in our world through a force that quantum physics is just beginning to understand. Then they're no longer miracles, they become a technology, something we can use and apply with wisdom and meaning in our lives. Something that we do in our lives triggers a process in our bodies. That process interacts with the world around us and changes our world. This is what the ancient spiritual traditions are saying to us in the language of their time. So now the question that many people are asking, we have this great mystery of science. How do we unify all that we know about our world? The great secret of spiritual traditions, something we do in our bodies affects our world. Could they be related in some way? Could the mystery and the secret be related? Well, what many researchers now are beginning to suspect is not only are they related, they're the same. They're equal. They're saying the same thing in very different languages. If we can get past our judgments of what science or religion is saying to us and look to the heart, to the essence of what has been left for us, we have the opportunity to create a wisdom that carries us beyond the greatest challenges that we'll ever face in any generation, if we have that wisdom. What happens if we marry the wisdom that was preserved intact, the completeness of our most cherished spiritual and religious traditions, with what the science, the bits and pieces that science now has shared with us? What if we marry them together? Many researchers are beginning to suspect that science and religion are both fragments of a greater and much older wisdom. That the science describes, in today's language, why our world works the way it works. Religions and spiritual traditions describe how we apply the knowledge. They didn't need to know the why. our left brains, our very left brain society. We need to know, where's that come from? Where'd you find that? Where can I get the research? Prove it to me. Show me how this works. Many ancient traditions, they acknowledged that it works. They didn't need to prove it, and they applied it in their lives. When our ancient ancestors were given the understandings, when they were handed the wisdom to understand what these relationships mean in our lives, what was really shared with them, and what does it mean in our lives today? Well, to understand this, we've got to go back and look at the lineage, look at the history of wisdom as it has come down to us today from the ancients. We are experiencing what some scholars call a broken chain of knowledge. And what we know is that throughout time, that wisdom has been edited. It has been deleted. Portions of the information have been captured and stored in great libraries. Some of it has been lost as those libraries are destroyed. If we're to go back and look at this lineage of wisdom and what has happened through the ages, we can identify two key times in our history when the chain of knowledge that links our modern world with our ancient ancestors has been broken. And the first of those is what is called the Great Library of Alexandria. The Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed by a fire from a civil war in 48 BC. It was created by the Greek Emperor Ptolemy I, and it was actually called a universal library, to the best of my knowledge. This is the first great library that was ever created for the sole purpose of preserving the information of human history. Well, the library, as we said, was burned in the fire during the Civil War. However, before it was burned, the Roman historian Callimachus was given the job of cataloging what was in this library. In the Great Library of Alexandria, over 400,000 scrolls that he described as mixed. A mixed scroll means that there were multiple authors contained on a single scroll. So over 400,000 mixed scrolls were in the Library of Alexandria. Over 90,000 additional scrolls were what he called unmixed, or scrolls of a single author, and an additional 42,000 scrolls that were not associated with any author at all, for a total of over 532,000 documents that were lost in that fire. Callimachus says to us is that included in those documents were some of the most ancient Hebraic documents, ancient Phoenician texts, Egyptian documents talking about the optics of ground glass and the medicines of Egypt. The entire Greek library was contained in the Library of Alexandria, and that was one of the first breaks in the chain of wisdom. The second great break came after the crucifixion of Jesus. What we know is this, that in the 4th century, during the year 325 AD, the Western biblical texts as we see them today did not exist. There was no nice, neat biblical text compiled into a book the way that we see today. There was a loose assemblage of manuscripts and documents. Some of them were poorly written. Some of them were redundant. Some of them were so mystical that even the scholars of the time had no idea what they meant. And they said, well, if we don't understand them, no one will ever understand them, so we might as well throw these documents out. Let me ask a question. If you're listening to this, you probably have had the opportunity to read at least a portion of our Western Bible. Have you ever felt like part of it was incomplete? You ever read the book of Genesis, for example? In the beginning, not much was happening, and all of a sudden, a lot of things were happening, and it happens in a single paragraph. Well, the answer to these questions, and this is part of the value of going back into some of our most cherished traditions, is that we begin to recover documents that were edited and lost. In the 4th century, in the year 325 AD, during what is known as the Council of Nicaea, at least 45 entire books were removed from our modern biblical text. 45 books were removed, and the ones that remained were condensed and rearranged into the story that we have today. So when we ask ourselves, where are all the women in the Bible? For example, we know of the books that were lost, there was an entire gospel of the birth of Mary. The birth of Mary describing her lineage as an Essene master and her being raised in a wisdom that supported the mystery and understanding of our relationship to the forces of nature around us. We know, for example, that there was not only one, there were 2 books describing the infancy of Jesus before he became the master as an adult. And to me, These books are fascinating. It's Infancy, Book 1, Infancy, Book 2. And they describe a young boy in ancient times coming to terms with a power that lives within his body that makes him so very, very different from the other children his age. There are stories, for example, in the book of Infancy of Jesus, Book 1. There's a story of Jesus playing with other children approximately his own age. And they're by a small stream, and they're fashioning small clay animals, small birds, out of the clay in the stream. And Jesus becomes frustrated, according to this text, because the animals are lifeless and they don't do anything. And he breathes life into these small clay animals, and they become animated, they become alive. And the other boys go home and tell their parents, and their parents get together with Jesus' parents and have a parent conference. And Jesus is helped to understand that he has powers and abilities that others do not have, and that there's a responsibility that comes with that. And from those kinds of stories, he learns that responsibility in his life. In the edited books of our Western Bible, there are an amazing series of documents, the letters of Herod and Pilate, a fascinating dialogue between Pontius Pilate, the governor who was responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, and King Herod. And the correspondence begins immediately after the crucifixion. And I'll just paraphrase a little bit about what these letters are all about. Pontius Pilate wrote the letter to King Herod, and he said, in effect, Herod, I think we've just made a really big mistake. And Herod attempted to distance himself from the entire situation. And he wrote a letter back, and he said, well, Pilate, what do you mean, we? He said, I had nothing to do with it, and the state of Rome had no interest in this man's death. That was a local decision. And it's a fascinating dialogue between the two men trying to come to terms with what they knew was a momentous and historic event. This is the kind of thing that we're finding. At least 45 books were removed. We know some of them were removed completely and never seen again. They were stored in the vaults of the Vatican libraries, and we find them today in private libraries such as the Habsburgs in Germany. Other books were reserved for scholars only, such as the first and the second book of Adam and Eve, the secrets of Enoch, the Psalms of Solomon. There are entire books that were written by Moses and Noah that we never get to see. So we know that there have been at least two major breaks in the lineage of wisdom that links our modern world with our ancient world. One of those was the burning of the Library of Alexandria. The second were the biblical edits of the 4th century. And as we bring this kind of information together, we flesh out, we begin to piece together the missing elements of our lives, our time, our history, and perhaps this is the kind of information that begins to fill in the missing pieces, describing our relationship to the mind of God and the force that links all of creation and how we apply it in our lives in ways that are meaningful to us today. One of the great finds of the 20th century, what has been called the single greatest archaeological find of the last century, was found in an area that is known as the Qumran area along the shores of the Dead Sea. There were a series of scrolls and documents and parchments that were found, and in those scrolls we began to find perhaps more information about our past and the most detailed information of our biblical history than we've ever found before. All of this information, tremendous amounts of information, was recovered between 1946 and 1959 in 11 caves on the shores on the western side of the Dead Sea, just outside of Jerusalem. Between those years, over 25,000 fragments of this copper and papyrus and parchment were discovered, and it was eventually pieced into approximately 900 scrolls. And those 900 scrolls, the job of piecing the scrolls together and of translating them and compiling the information and publishing all of this was given to a team of only 7 scholars. And there were 7 male scholars. And up until very recently, those 7 scholars were the only people that had access to this library of information that's now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. Within this library that we find the oldest recorded documents of the original books of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew book of the Torah, which became the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The scribes who penned the information in these scrolls placed them in the caves long before the edits of the 4th century ever happened. So that when these documents were discovered for the first time in a very, very long time, we actually saw the original words, the original text. So to really understand what the scrolls are saying to us today, I think we have to ask the question, who recorded the scrolls in the first place? Where did the Dead Sea Scrolls come from? Scholars are pretty much in agreement that the scrolls originally were penned by a mysterious sect called the ancient Essenes. We first hear about the Essenes arriving about 500 years before the time of Jesus on the shores of the Dead Sea in an area known as Qumran. In the Qumran area, the Essenes separated themselves from the societies and the communities around them so that they could live and honor the traditions of a teaching that was already ancient in their time. Well, the mystery of the Essenes and precisely who they were and where they came from, no one knows precisely where they came from. There are a lot of theories, and we really don't know for certain. What we know is that they were in the Qumran area about 500 years, not long after the crucifixion of Jesus. They were persecuted tremendously. Well, when they fled the area, the records show that they fled into the mountains of Egypt. And we find records of the Essenes going into the Sinai Peninsula in those areas today. We know that they fled into the highlands of Central Asia, and what today we call the area of Tibet. What is lesser known is the plight of the Essenes into the Americas. We know that today we find active Essene monasteries in South America between the borders of Bolivia and Peru. Evidence of the Essenes has actually been found in North America among the Native American tribes in the desert Southwest, and the Navajo and the Hopi. And they speak about their brothers from the east that journeyed to them over 2,000 years ago and spoke to them what the Essenes called the angels of the fire, the angels of the air, the angels of the water, and the angels of the earth. As we look at the world today, this highly technological, very sophisticated world that we've built in the West, what we must ask ourselves is, are we happy in this world? And does this world serve us? Does it really serve us? What I think we're searching for as a society, what I believe we're searching for as a civilization, is a yardstick. Is we find ourselves in the uncharted territory of what to do with this technology that we're developing, the technology in the very first part of this program. We now have the power to change our gene pool, to change the weather around us, to create new forms of matter, new forms of life, the power to build tremendous weapons with the destruction potential exponentially greater than anything we've ever known before. And as we find ourselves a species still defined by our differences, in the presence of such tremendous technologies, we ask ourselves, we must find a yardstick, a guiding principle by which we measure the choices that we make in our lives from this point forward. And if we can find that yardstick, even though we've crossed the boundary or way beyond right and wrong, I think that we may not go wrong. And I believe that that single principle is that we must find a way to honor the principle of life in whatever we do. If we can hold life sacred, if we can hold the principle of human life and all life sacred in each choice that we make, whether we're talking about weapons or we're talking about genetic engineering, whether we're talking about weather or we're talking about taking our civilization to other worlds, because we're in uncharted territory, we don't know the answers. But what I do know is if we can hold that principle sacred, I believe we won't go wrong. What we know right now is that the choices of our past, the choices that have denied life, the choices that affirm life, those choices must be made in the lives of individuals before they become the choices of our collective response to this time in history. Through the field that has the intelligence that links all of creation, that field is reminding us right now two things. That all matter is consciousness. There is a consciousness in this table. There's a consciousness in this glass, in these plants. It is conscious. Whether or not it's alive or not, I haven't said that. It is conscious. We are interacting with it. All matter is consciousness. All matter is related. What you're feeling in your heart right now has an impact on what's happening halfway around the world. We are the collective answer to the challenges that are being given to us in Jerusalem right now, for example. This field is telling us this. It's telling us matters conscious, matters related. It is giving us the wisdom. We now, through this field, can discover whether or not consciousness is the same thing as life, and we can discover whether or not if life is necessarily human. When does the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen of our Earth become what we call human? We have to answer these questions before we know whether or not we can go forward intelligently. And behind closed doors, this is happening. It's hard to talk about in some scientists. It's a very, very different way of thinking. Others say we've got to do this and we've got to do it quick because our technology is pushing us to this place. Our new wisdom of this field allows new choices in science, new choices in technology, new choices in medicine, choices in peace in our world. We begin simply by honoring the principle of life, diversity, religion, and science and spirituality that led us to this point. We must honor the principles of life. That's what all these traditions have said. That's what science is finding in its own language. Honor the principle of life. We can never go wrong if we're honoring that principle. We asked the question earlier, who is the matrix of creation? Who else could it be? You and I are part of that matrix. We're not separate from it. We are a part of that matrix of creation. We are all living within the mind of God. Quantum scientists are saying this. They're finding new particles, and they are using spiritual names for those particles. The new particles, the quarks, are called the quark truth, the quark beauty, the quark up, the quark down, the quark strange, and all the anti-particles, anti-truth, anti-strange, anti-up, anti-down, anti-beauty, because the physicists have found a realm where the old ideas must change. They're finding something very new. We live within the mind of God. We can never go wrong if we're honoring that principle. And as we do that, the choices that have destroyed and denied life in the past become the choices that affirm life in our present, in our future.
You know, I'm a systems thinker, and I'm looking at everything happening in the world, distressed through the suffering, obviously. And yet I know that there's a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is what always fascinates me. Sometimes I look at it through the best science of the modern world, but I'm also fascinated, John, by, for lack of a better term, what I would call comparative prophecy. Because there are so many different traditions from different times in history that seem to converge in our lifetime right now. And when we think about people 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, looking into our time right now, what we're calling this, essentially, they were ancient remote viewers. From their point in history, they were looking along timelines. And if nothing changes in the timeline between them and where we are now, then they were reporting to the best of their ability in the language that was available to them and with the geography available to them, what they saw happening. So what's fascinating to me is the events unfolding in the world in general and in the Middle East specifically are so accurately depicted in some of these ancient prophecies. And two things. First of all, it tells us that these timelines are real, because you can't make this stuff up. I mean, you're looking at, and some of these are biblical, and I'm going to separate the biblical information from the religiosity that developed around them. So some of those are biblical, where they go so far as to identify what nations actually hook up with other nations to converge on the nation of Israel, for example, the geographic locations where they come from. But there's another piece of this, John, and this is a piece that very few people are talking about right now, is that the outcome of all of this tragedy and all this suffering actually leads to something really beautiful that is called 1,000 years of peace. Where I first began to hear about this, I think most people are familiar with the book of Revelation as in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. What a lot of people probably don't know, John, is that book is incomplete. And we get the version that ends with the dark version of what's possible. In the Vatican Library, the second half of the book of Revelation, the good news is not shared by many people. And it's the prophet John that spoke to the powers that be, the angels in heaven, or the community on the mothership, however you want to look at it. And he said, do these things need to happen? Is there another way? And they came back to him and they said, yes, there's always another way. But someone, they said, who on earth is worthy of listening to a greater possibility? And John says, I will. I'll be the one that listens. And he's the one that opens the seals on the books, and it reveals a new earth. For the old earth had disappeared. And it reveals a beautiful time of hope and possibility and thriving and brotherhood and sisterhood and peace among people. And that is the message that's left out. And what the message for the whole book is, it's up to us. It's our choice. And I'm also fascinated by, and we've talked about this to some degree in the past, what, for lack of a better term, is called the Bible code or the Torah codes, the mathematic messages that are now being collated through modern computer algorithms based only on the first 5 books of the Old Testament. When you convert the letters into numbers, you load them into the array, and you do the search algorithms, there is the history of the world, and every event that has happened in the world is encoded into those Torah codes. And what this suggests, John, is that I think it supports the simulation argument, that we're living in a simulation, and that those codes represent the quantum possibilities of everything that could happen, but it's up to us to choose. And so this has been on my mind because so many people feel like there's no other way, and we're locked in to the horrible things that we're seeing, and what we sense is on the horizon that will happen unless we make another choice. And what I'm sensing, I'm just going to go back, the evidence suggests greater than not that we're living in a simulation, that we're in a virtual environment, and that the code for that virtual environment lives within each of us. It may be that the events of the world drive us to transcend, not to battle one-on-one, good on evil, but to transcend that polarity. And that's how we shift the timeline. If we're going to get through this, we're going to have to think differently. And I think that difference may drive us into feeling and sensing into a new reality that carries us into that new timeline. And I always use the example of a rocket launch from Earth to the moon. If you're off just a little bit on Earth, by the time that rocket reaches the moon, that little distance is translated. You're going to miss the mark. It makes a huge difference on the other end. We don't need to have the entire transitional shift. All we need is enough of a shift to move us off of that mark so that we can begin on a new timeline, on that new trajectory. When I dive into this, I think there's something even more profound that's happening. Rather than splitting off and leaving this old world and we go into this new world, I think the message of the resurrection, the message of transfiguration, is that we shift this world from within to become a different world rather than leaving this world and going somewhere, to a better world. I think we're looking at the potential of transforming this world, a resurrection on a mass scale. And to do that is where we transcend this polarity between the good and evil. And it's hard to do because of what we see happening in the world right now. I think there's a level where the battle has to play out, but I think there are tactics in that battle. And again, I go back, it seems hopeless unless now you apply the science that says there's over a 90% probability that we're in a virtual reality. And that virtual reality, you learn the rules of the physics of that virtual reality, and then you can engage the game in a very, very different way. I think that's the movies that we're creating that we call entertainment, I think are telling us this is our subconscious reminding us through what we call entertainment of something that is dormant and perhaps forgotten within us. I think this is us informing ourselves, consciousness informing itself. So we begin doing this by approaching, and this is, some people call this splitting hairs. So there's a battle. I believe there's always a time when you can avoid the battle. And when the momentum, when the reaches beyond the threshold, then you're in it. And the only way out of it is to go through it. What does the battle make us become? What does the battle do to us? How do we approach that battle? If we approach the battle from the perspective of hate and revenge, then we've succumbed to the darkness, and the darkness is won. If we can engage in that battle from the love of what we know is possible in the world that we know is possible in our hearts, we're still fighting, but we're fighting from a different perspective, and we become a different person. And there's some people that say, Greg, you're splitting hairs. What difference does it make? The battle is still the battle. And the answer is yes. However, on a spiritual level, it's like night and day. On a spiritual level, do we fight that battle and become the best version of ourselves in doing that? And I know that's a very different way of thinking, John, but I really believe that's what's up for all of us individually. What does the information that we're seeing on our YouTube channel make us into? What is it doing to us? What does it allow us to become? That's the battle right there. I think the value of a simulation theory is it gives us a new vocabulary from which to think about very ancient and polarized religious ideas. If you think of this as a simulation, we're somewhere else projecting into these avatars, into these bodies that are mostly empty space to begin with.
Right.
We're somewhere else. And there are rules that govern that simulation and how it unfolds. But as a computer scientist, what I know is this: a simulation has a beginning and an end. And there are a number of ways that can end a simulation. It can be a data overload when you run out of space. We're creating so much digital information to be held in this system. Maybe we're going to have some kind of an overload, or the simulation may, on a cyclic basis, go through a reset. And what you're talking about, I believe, could be the catalyst for the reset. The difference is, in the reset, we live through the reset and we begin a new simulation. What I think is so interesting is so many of, whether you're talking about indigenous Native American prophecy or you're talking about biblical prophecy, and many people believe these are what we're living are end times prophecies, or you're talking about the mathematics, the statistical mathematics of the Torah code that are beyond anything that could happen by coincidence. There's something was given to our world 3,000 years ago that has a record of every possibility. It doesn't predict what will happen. When you query it, it will give you relationships. So, for example, right now, within this last week, a query was done in the Torah codes about what's happening in the Middle East right now. And the big word that came up across was that it's a time of redemption. So I think what we may be awakening to is that we're not locked in to a series of events that our leaders have chosen. When we choose to not let the events of the Middle East incite fear, hate, revenge, and anger, which is what we're seeing happen on American college campuses right now. when we refuse to let those events divide us at the family dinner table and between our neighbors, that is how this battle is going to be won, because we're refusing to allow it to turn us into something that betrays our truest nature. Our truest nature is not hate and revenge. We can do it to survive, but it's not our nature. So claiming our truest nature, I think, is an evolutionary shift that sets the stage for that 1,000 years of peace at the beginning of the next reset. So we're going to live through a reset of the simulation rather than leaving the simulation. And, you know, people talk about the tribulation, where a lot of people leave the planet and go somewhere else, and they come back later for the 1,000 years of peace. Maybe those are the people that are going to take a break, leave the simulation, and they come back. I personally, I would prefer not to be a part of that. I'd prefer to stay with my brothers and sisters, with the people I love, through the dark, dark times, to navigate and help one another get through this. I don't want to bail out and then come back just for the good days.